Hope everyone's had a lovely November. A new month meant a new Revolution balance patch, as well as another Grand Prix on the books. A lot of shakeups happened to kick this month off, and while I'm late to the party on discussing these, I felt it was best to make sure I tackled these changes so you all could be on the same page going into future months. Cart's gotta come before the horse, and patch notes have to come before we start planning for next month's big event. Gonna try and make this a quicker one, as a lot of you have had the month to get used to the status quo, so this is less scripted and more off the cuff just to keep this going fast. Let's jump in. Before we get into it, I want to talk about the absence of content for the last month and a half. I've had a hectic time reorganizing myself since Hurricane Milton, which resulted in a few personal projects and plans falling by the wayside, among them being Revolution and this channel. Unfortunately, I still have a lot I'm juggling, but I have a few ideas kicking around in my head for things to push your way, and I'm very excited to return to Eternal Play with December's GP. Finally, before we get into the card changes directly, I've gotten some comments here and there from folks interested in the format and curious to know how to participate, as well as some folks who've mentioned they found the format through this channel, and I'm so happy to see everyone having fun with it. Below in the description are links to two vital resources for playing, the Custom Magic Discord server and the Revolution Manifesto search engine. The Discord server is your best way to get in touch with the Revolution community, as well as custom MTG fan designers. Whether you're looking to talk about the cards you like in Revolution, participate in a league or GP run, or even just give designing a set a try for yourself. The latter, the Manifesto, is your best bet for looking up any cards that catch your interest, regularly updated with card changes when the monthly patch rolls around. Both are tremendously valuable resources if you're looking to give the format a try for yourself. I'd also like to add that while I do have a very full plate, one of the things on that plate is a proper full format introduction guide. I don't have a set goal for when to get that pulled together and uploaded, but keep your eyes peeled for it eventually. All right, let's talk patch notes. 33 cards received targeted changes to their abilities, text, numbers, a lot of shifts, alongside a full mechanic rework this month. Blows were dealt to Black Colorless, Theros Shrines, Builder of Monuments Scam, Black Red Ruins, Mono Red Aggro. But there is the most important part of all of this that we should talk about before we dive into individual cards. Prior to November, Integrate allowed you to choose any permanent to integrate an exiled card onto. Starting with November, Integrate can't let you choose lands. Ultimately, what this means is that it is harder to constantly have cards integrated and sitting around, as all of the things that have integrated cards on them are much more vulnerable to removal, just improving interactability of the mechanic. Some integrate cards aren't really affected by this at all, some are impacted pretty drastically, and two really required full reworks to make them function under this change. Neither of those cards are particularly playable, so let's get started with them and then move on to the more important cards to talk about. Mirror-Meld Spire was a debatably okay inclusion in Black Colorless decks. It was a decent integrate generator, but really all it changes is it copies any mana abilities or any abilities from any lands on permanents you control, not just cards integrated to it. While it can't consistently keep things, this might honestly have ended up being a buff, because now your top deck Mirror-Meld Spire could still get abilities from like the Theros Devotion creature lands that you integrated earlier on in the game. I don't think it's gonna make this card any like astoundingly better, but it's like slightly better, and that's a decent point for Mirror-Meld Spire, I guess, especially when Integrate as a whole kind of took a big hit here. The other of these overhauls is Silverbrone Chromate, which just like considerably shifted here. It went from being just sort of a decent stat bomb to being able to be a bit harder to confidently remove. There's some like funky janky combo with Azantium being able to copy this ability as long as you can make Silverbrone Chromate an artifact, but it's just so profoundly janky. The best way I found to make it work is an 8-card combo. It's just bad. But hey, Chromate is a little funkier for any of your brewers out there. Data Weaver is one of the more ubiquitous cards going into this patch, and it kind of suffered hard. From my understanding, Data Weaver has really felt this change the most of all of the integrate cards, as it now can no longer safely tuck your integrated cards onto lands and can no longer take advantage of other ones safely tucked away. Further, it's now limited to only allowing you to play a single integrated card each turn rather than playing them uncapped. So not only are the cards less reliable to have available for Data Weaver, but Data Weaver also just can't let you play as many things as you used to be able to, which kind of hurts. Tithe to the Machine has proven to be a reliable stacks piece, even with constant changes, so it received another one this month, making sure that you can't just get rid of it for any reason and then make a bunch of tokens. Previously, it was kind of resilient to removal and made it really difficult to properly interact with, since clearing your opponent's Tithe to the Machine would just give them a bunch of 2/2s for their trouble. Now, you actually have to be the one to cash in your own Tithe to the Machine for the bodies, so still does what it was intended to do, just without the whole anti-interaction piece. Chronicle of Extinction was my pick for the most impactful change of the bunch here. I think there's a lot of other changes here that were really notable and really shifted the meta in drastic ways, but I honestly feel like Chronicle was the big hit. Originally, this video was going to open up with me claiming that this would change everything, and I think it really has. Because honestly, as simple as it is, shifting Chronicle of Extinction from a -3/-3 sweeper to a -2/-2 makes it far less ubiquitous and far more toolboxy. You can't just reliably jam it in the main deck for the sweeper mode and leverage the Edict and hand attack modes when you need. You kind of need a deck to either actively care about one of those other two modes and then get the sweeper when you need it, or accept that it's just a decent sideboard card. I don't think this card's unplayable. I think the sweeper's still fine. I think the utility and flexibility is great, but I think this just kind of hurts its overall playability. So, probably going to see a lot less Chronicle of Extinction moving forward. Lurking Virkolakis also got a pretty significant overhaul. No longer has lifelink innately, but does start out as a 2/2 instead of a 1/1, which is a little less notable when you remember that its enter trigger was always making it a 2/2, and especially notable since it no longer triggers on enter, only on attack. It also now targets the card you're exiling rather than choosing a player to choose a card that gets exiled, so a little more direct graveyard hate, but also able to be disrupted a little more efficiently. And now you have to choose between scaling Lurking Virkolakis with counters or giving it temporary lifelink. I don't think Lurking Virkolakis is dead. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it might still be a solid sideboard card as like an anti-graveyard piece. But it's another case of a utility tech card being far too flexible and far too potent and kind of needing to get the hammer for it. I think this one's deserved. I loved playing with Lurking Virkolakis, as you've probably seen with some of my video content with this card in particular. I think it was just too efficient, and I think this is a change that makes it feel in the spirit of the card without still being kind of a concerning outlier. Iris Pledge is another multi-purpose card that got changed, having its final mode shifted to be burn instead of additional card advantage. I think this is just the best case scenario for this card. I feel like this final mode now is good parallel to the white ability mode. I think it provides more texture to the decks that it's in because it gives you a way to have reach on your removal. But I'm not so certain that it's going to be like this instantly stellar card. I think Iris Pledge does a lot of cool things. I think this card is still really sweet. I think we're still going to see it for a long time, but every single time this card gets knocked, I think it might be over for Iris Pledge, and it still keeps on cropping up. So I think this card is going to continue to rock people's world and do some really great things for any black control deck that might want to use it. probably the actual biggest change that I underestimated going into this patch. Uh, Rooftop Slink is quite frankly dead. I don't think this card's terrible. I think it's still pretty solid. But the fact of the matter is, being able to Cyber Soul it on turn 2 after playing it on turn 1 was such a profound use for the card that just increasing its Cyber Soul cost by 1 does wonders to push it out of the format. But I don't think that's the sole reason it's being pushed out of the format, because we are having Extravagant Patisserie also get reworked. I think this is probably the more reasonable change of the two in terms of like mitigating problematic play patterns, but I think both are ultimately appropriate given the case that we have here. Rooftop Slink really was just such a brutal turn 1 into turn 2 line, making your opponent discard a card starting turn 2 while also having to deal with a 2/2 flyer that was just going to keep shredding your opponent's hand and was just going to keep growing once they run out of cards. It really was just such a potent card, and turn 1 Rooftop Slink into turn 2 Transform was one of the best openers that the format had at the time, that I think this really did open up the format a lot more to not be so desperate to have to kill Rooftop Slink on turn 1 or 2. And the Patisserie change really does limit it and any other Cyber Soul card and any other artifact abuse pretty significantly, because it no longer freely enters untapped to make the food token. You have to choose if you want the untapped colorless land or the food token when you play it. I think this is a healthy change for the format. And just moving quickly, we also have this change for Stone Circle in Eternal, which is relevant with Rev Eternal coming next month. I think this is really good for the format. I love my artifact shenanigans. I love Extravagant Patisserie and Stone Circle. I loved using these to kind of get some unfair things done. The fact of the matter is, this format's trying to stray away from doing a bunch of unfair things. It wants you to try and, wants you to try and really fight for the pieces that you get. And I think this is a very good change for the format as a whole. Even if it means we're not going to be seeing as much Extravagant Patisserie or Stone Circle anymore. Gustav Pact Maker is our first card that wasn't just like dedicated black colorless. This was seeing some play in blue-black shells trying to take advantage of Feast of Whispered Knives, even with the change to make it legendary. And Gustav proved to be pretty solid off of a Lay Shard, being able to be played on turn 3, immediately have the Indulgence trigger up, and being able to tutor any card you want to your hand. Now, I'm not so sure about 5-mana Gustav. There's still a lot of relevant things that he can find. And notably, he has 5 toughness now than over 4. So, Gleaming Laser, Dante's Inferno don't just take him out in one shot. Notably for Revolution Eternal, Gustav is now flawless with 5-mana 5/5, so can't be killed by Fatal Flaw either. Don't think that's going to be relevant for Eternal, but with December coming, it's worth noting. I think the biggest killer here, even more than the mana increase, is the change to the ability. I think the tutor was so powerful and was such a good reason to justify trying Gustav. And while that new Indulge trigger is still really versatile and able to get a lot of solid cards from your deck, I think there really aren't many worthwhile demons, so it's really getting an instant sorcery or getting a Clowna from the top 7. Good cards to get for sure, but I'm less enthusiastic about Gustav at 5. Sweet card, but just not as exciting now. And unfortunately, it's rotating in January, so we're not going to really see it in Standard again. Stolen Secrets was also doing some problematic things in blue-black decks, because blue-black was doing a lot of theft things, and Stolen Secrets does some crazy good theft things. It was also being used to accelerate Protoclass Behemoth. I know I abandoned the Big Bad Dino after the pre-GP patch in October, but I also know folks like Split Moon were still experimenting with the Behemoth, and Stolen Secrets was a great way to just discount it by 4. I think Secrets is not terrible, but I think it's looking a lot worse now. I think it's honestly where it should be. I think it's like it's still fine. It's still perfectly reasonable. I think it's even still very good with Callisto in play. I'm very happy to see it not ramping out behemoths. uh, we've got a lot of shrine changes to talk about here. Shrine to Keranos no longer mandates you discard a card, but now only draws if you can discard a card. I think this is fine. I think this card is still absolutely great. I think, like it's not as good when your hand is empty, because previously, if your hand was empty, Shrine would just straight up draw you a card. I I think this is still going to be a really solid card. I think Shrine to Keranos is still something you could absolutely consider playing outside of dedicated Shrine decks because it's such a good engine to like grease the wheels and make sure that you're finding what you need to. Shrine to Phoenix was the biggest hit of the shrines, as they kind of just reshifted the shrines to have a different core game plan. This is another case of Shrine to Phoenix being another way of like stealing your opponent's cards, kind of just getting toned down. I feel I would be much more enthusiastic about this card if it could mill yourself as well. I've done a lot of tinkering with the Black Laystone because I love self mill for two. I love self mill engines. I don't think milling your opponent is all that good of a plan, so I think Shrine to Phoenix is not that great, and I don't think the Scry 2 is going to be making it super stellar. But hey, if you're playing a dedicated Shrine deck, you might still play it as like a one of. The Scry 2 is not terrible. Shrine of Those Forgotten is another big one that got a pretty notable nerf. Relatively simple, just enters tapped, but it does make it far harder to just use it to suddenly explode in mana. You really have to be more proactive with Shrine of Those Forgotten. I think this card's still great for your dedicated Shrine decks, but it's just not immediate acceleration anymore. So shrines get a little slower. On top of that, some things got shuffled around for the other multicolor shrines. Shrine to Karametra and Shrine to Iroas both previously did token generation things. Now Shrine to Karametra does an Anthem for your pump for your team if you have any creatures to want to pump in your shrine decks. A little finicky because there's, I think, less token generation for shrine decks overall, but still an option. I think this is just out of dedicated shrine decks though, because again, I think shrines just can't make as many tokens now, and I think Shrine to Karametra really doesn't make the cut in that regard. Shrine to Iroas is a little funky on first blush. Granting first strike or double strike is interesting, but I don't know if I would want to run a 2-mana enchantment to like have a chance to maybe grant double strike. But there's an important thing to note here, which is that it can give shrines double strike, because Shrine to Kruphix can now animate your shrines instead of your creatures. I think this is really critical. I think if you're playing a dedicated shrine deck, there's something worth noting in that you have the 1-mana shrines, Athreos, Phoenix, and Erebos, all castable on a black mana on turn 1 with an untapped swamp into Shrine to Kruphix, swing for 3 on turn 2. I think this is the core of your 5-color shrines decks now. I think this is not as good of a game plan as 5-color shrines used to have, but I am really crazy happy to see something more funky and weird happening with these shrines decks. I don't think Shrine to Pharika is all that interesting. I don't think granting Death Touch to your team is all that relevant. There's some like funky things you can do with Everdiki and like other Death Touch synergies, where you can have your whole board potentially get a lot of value if you have multiple shrines, or even just like if you're granting one creature Death Touch, maybe you grant it to Shredding Dragon, because I mean, hey, like start pinging stuff down. I don't think it's going to be all that good. And sure enough, I can't speak to how prevalent shrines have been in the meta, but from my understanding, I don't think any of them are really bothering with this card, and I don't blame them. Shrine to Nylea does get buffed, just outright, knocked down by 1 mana, which is initially really appealing, but again, shrines aren't going as wide now. And Shrine to Those Forgotten entering tapped is also going to just hurt how quickly you can ramp this out. So I love Shrine to Nylea. It's one of the shrines that I think is more fun to just play with on its own. or play with like a bunch of other shrines, it's just not as good now, despite it being cheaper. And it really has nothing to do with itself. It really has to do with the other shrines that are available and how they've changed. Notably, we do still have a token generator present in the shrines decks. It's just that role has gone to Shrine of Clothes, which previously was our key anthem, like make our creatures bigger shrine, and is now just gonna make us a 1/1 with haste that you only get temporarily unless you have 3 or more shrines. Again, shrines just don't go anywhere near as wide as they used to. If you don't have the like shrine threshold, losing your token every turn also kind of feels bad because it's just you can't really use them to chump block. You can't really use them to come up the board. It's not bad. I think it's still a great shrine for the shrines decks, as all of the token maker shrines were previously. But I think it's just a lot more awkward now. Shrine to Afara does notably tap things and put a stun counter on them if it's got the shrine threshold. I think this makes it decently playable, but like it's just kind of going to slow things down. You kind of want to slow things down, but it's not going to win you games. Solid utility card for the deck, though. Shrine to Erebos is the last shrine that got changed, and honestly my favorite of these changes, even more than Crewfix, because it went from a like funky, weird recursion reanimator piece to rebuy what few creatures you could possibly justify running in a shrine deck, or just like a weird piece for recurring small creatures, to now being a draw engine for shrines that you can potentially activate twice in a turn cycle to just dig so deep. Especially when Shrine to Athreos can help pad your life total and mitigate the life loss from Shrine to Erebos. I'm really fond of this. I think this is a really sweet engine for the deck, and I really love how it takes advantage of the Shrine plan. Nykthos is one other buff to Shrines, shaving down a pip from the mana cost from 4 mana to 3 mana, as well as shaving off 1 from its power and toughness. This would be bad if Chronicle of Extinction hadn't gotten changed, but with Chronicle of Extinction's change, it doesn't suddenly become more vulnerable to that. But there are things that didn't kill it that could now, things that care about 3 toughness by either reducing toughness by 3 or dealing 3 damage. The latter isn't so relevant if you have a bunch of shrines, but I still think this card's just kind of a janky inclusion that you're not crazy to have in. You're crazy about having in your shrines decks because it's just so unclear where it fits in best. Moving on to stuff besides the 2 big decks that got hit, Builder Monuments had its tap ability shifted to just be part of its attack trigger that gives it a build counter. This does do some work to try and mitigate untapping it for additional value. It was being used to tap to get like instant counter spells out of your deck, like Spellbane Sentinel, Omen of Deception, tap down your opponent's things with Sleep Restricts and Security Initiative, which Strix you could pick up with Codename Cicada to start repeating it, while Security Initiative could just untap Builder to draw a card before spinning again. And you could even get Voyage to the Siren Sea, which previously not only made it a 5/5 unblockable creature, which, by the way, it can still do that with the current version of Builder Monuments, but it also was essentially just letting you use Builder to get extra turns over and over. Now, Builder is an attack trigger, so you can't untap it to spam it, and Voyage to the Siren Sea was changed to be a card draw piece from an extra turn piece. And being honest, I think it's still solid. I think if you're going to play Voyage to the Siren Sea with Builder Monuments, and I think you're playing it with Builder Monuments, I think you're still happy to have this as just card draw engine. I think it's still solid for blue tempo. So, and if anything, I think it's better for blue tempo now because you don't care as much about the turn, but you do love the card draw. And if you're hitting with like 5 cheap flyers, paying 1 to draw 3 cards, and either from this having made one of your things unblockable, or just having had this put in your graveyard from one of your other creatures getting removed. Even if you're paying like 2 or 3, this is like 2 or 3 mana, draw 3 cards, go do more things afterwards. And if you're in a mid to late game scenario, this is draw 3 at instant speed from your graveyard. So it's a way to use your mana if you're holding up counter spells and they give you no reason to play them. There were other changes to the Scam deck as well. Sleeper Strix no longer picks itself up when you surveil. Instead, you just get to look at extra cards. I don't think this kills its synergy with Codename Cicada. It just recontextualizes it. Sleeper Strix is still a pretty solid card. It's just not going to mass tap things. Though, honestly, I think it broadens the pool of cards that could consider it, just because, there's a lot of surveil stuff going on. Security Initiatives change is a simple one. It just doesn't tap lands anymore. I thought this was going to happen in September, honestly. I didn't think curators wanted there to be an ice in the format. But it turns out the only reason an ice is problematic is when your 4-mana 4/5 tutors it. So, fair enough. I still like the potential for Surveillance State to be used as a combo card. It's just really hard to know how reliable that can be and what the best ways to combo with it are, since flipping Security Initiative isn't exactly trivial, and it's still not going to be, amazing to get Surveillance State unless you have the perfect build for it, but I think there is still some cool stuff to be done here. Forgotten Cultivator got a pretty significant change. One of 2 ruins that got a solid hit. It went back to being a 4/4 from a 3/3, which is pretty notable in terms of its ability to kill people, which, very important for the ruins deck. But notably, it doesn't generate value on entering anymore, only on attacking, which I think does a lot to hamper Forgotten Cultivator's momentum. It was kind of a ubiquitous card when I first got back into the format, just because, it always was going to be generating, multiple cards of value, dodges sorcery speed removal, and just became such a headache to deal with for, every mid-range control deck wanting to run Forgotten Cultivator, generate value, return permanent cards, milk cards, build up their graveyard, just so many things that Forgotten Cultivator did relatively effortlessly. I don't think this card's terrible, but I think this does a lot to rein in its ubiquity, which I think is really important. Tyrant's Remnants also got a change to its momentum, but in this case, just kind of making sure it doesn't buff the power of Spellcharged Ruins. I think this is a relatively subtle change. I think this is a pretty significant one. I never really got to play against or with Black-Red Ruins a whole lot, but my opinion was always that they felt like they were kind of just hanging on by a thread. They were just fast enough to justify running them over other strategies, especially since, they are pretty resilient to sorcery speed removal, particularly board wipes. But I think every time a ruin gets changed, I'm a little more skeptical about it persisting into the format's future. I could totally be wrong. We could totally get into January and return to regular Revolution, get a new rotation, and then Ruins wins the tournament. But I don't think that's going to happen, honestly. Finally, we have a few cards for Red. Red was kind of just mono Red was proving to be a pretty solid piece of the puzzle for the format, really just one of the best aggro decks in the format. So 2 things got changed here to just sort of tone it back a little bit. Ephemia of the Horse doesn't get ward anymore, which I think is pretty important. I think being able to interact with this thing is really necessary. It was never going to cost you extra mana to deal with an Ephemia that was getting a lot of value, but the life payment was going to hurt against a mono-red aggro deck. So I think not having to pay life to interact with Ephemia is pretty important for the momentum that this deck can carry. Also critical is that Rock On has been shifted to have its +2/+0, and +1/+0 swap positions. Previously, it was only ever giving +1/+0 naturally, but able to give up to +5. Now, it has a better floor. It gives more power baseline. It just caps out at a less remarkable ceiling of +4. I think this card's still solid. +4/+0 first strike for 1 mana is really damn good. But I also understand that the meta might change and push this to a place where it's just not going to be as played. So Um, I hope you enjoy rocking on, but I think a lot of people are going to probably not. Finally, there was a slight change to Everdiki. Uh, I genuinely don't remember. Right. It was just that she didn't count herself when she hits player or planeswalker, and that was an oversight. She was intended to count herself. So they fixed it. She now triggers when she hits people instead of just your other creatures. So she's now like not an insignificant card. I think there's still going to be like a couple pieces to the puzzle to make Everdiki a real thing, but every time they change her, I'm a little more optimistic. Maybe she needs like one more buff. I don't know. Maybe we just need the next set that rotates in to be a dedicated Gorgon set. That's what we're asking for in January. That's what Everdiki needs in January. But yeah, no, I think I like this card a little more every time I look at it. It's not quite there. It doesn't have the home it needs. Um, but yeah, that is the entirety of our discussion for the Revolution card changes. I know I'm late on covering all of these again, but like I just wanted to make sure we'd all be on the same page going into Revolution Eternal. And make sure that I wasn't just skipping over this for the sake of trying to get on to other things. I hope you all are satisfied with your understanding of what happened for this month coming into the state of the meta. And I hope you're excited about Revolution Eternal, because I know I am. And I can't wait to start talking about it. Take care, everybody, and I will see you in the Revolution chat.